Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, July 19th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the SEC Media Days. A ton came out of Dallas this last week, so we'll get you updated on all the biggest things that you need to be in tune about for the SEC going into this season. Then we'll get into a kind of an interesting thing about possibly the Power Four being in charge of themselves, breaking off from the NCAA structure and kind of being able to make their own rules and kind of operate separate from the Group of Five and the lower FCS schools, which would be a very, very transformative thing in college sports. Then we'll get into helmet comms. It's one of those things that came up a ton in Dallas in the SEC Media Days, and honestly has kind of been one of the more under-talked about biggest changes that is coming to this sport this year, so I want to kind of unpack that a little bit more. Then we'll get into hinge players in the Big Ten. There are so many guys. This one's a little bit more straightforward just because I think the Big Ten is a little bit more straightforward this upcoming year, but definitely some guys that could totally change the way that conference is viewed this year. And then we'll do a Friday weekend wrap up with all of the headlines that we missed throughout the week that we couldn't fit into a full segment, what have you. So a ton of stuff to update you guys on today. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, please do. Again, it's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's get underway. Let's talk about the SEC Media Days. There was so much stuff happening out in Dallas, and it was a fitting spot for that place to be because right in between those two schools that you're adding in OU and Texas, it's about 7 miles that separate the distance between them and Dallas. So obviously, this was a very, very good venue, and there is a lot of stuff to take out of this. Obviously, Nick Saban was a huge topic of conversation, even when he's not a coach. He's always going to be that way whenever he's around college football. He's the voice of college football for as long as until further notice, is the way I'll put it, I suppose. Texas also dominated conversation, but the person I want to start with is the guy up top. Greg Sankey came to this thing angry. He came into this thing with a lot of aggression, I'll be totally honest with you, and he is one of those types of guys. He is going to speak his mind. He is not super worried about what other people think about him because he's sitting in a pretty good spot where he is right now as the commissioner of the SEC, but he had some things to say. Let's just put it that way. He took a little bit of a shot at Florida State about how he put it, complaining about not getting into the playoff. He talked about how UGA was another fantastic team that probably you could argue deserved to be in that didn't complain quite as much. He took a subtle little shot there, talked about conference realignment, which is obviously something that we've unpacked a ton on here, and basically just said he doesn't want to cut the pie into more pieces. That's exactly what he said, actually. And a lot of people interpreted that as ESPN is not changing that contract anytime soon. They are not, pushing more money towards the SEC for them to bring in FSU and Clemson. Maybe they'll do it for UNC and Duke because, frankly, I think that carries a little bit more weight in those conversations. But as of right now, it feels like those media deals are kind of set in stone. And usually that's kind of the moniker of how aggressive can you be in the conference realignment world, is how much money do you have in that media deal and how kind of malleable is that media deal. So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch. I think Florida State and Clemson, they're not going to be in the SEC. I feel very confident about that, at least this time around. I think if we get 2 or 3 years down the road and this thing continues on as it has and the SEC and the Big Ten continue to just gobble up the sport pretty much, I think there's a world where they find their way in at some point. But as of right now, it doesn't seem like they're really getting much traction at all. So it's going to be the Big 12. I feel really confident about that at this point. I think going back to the ACC at this point would cause maybe more problems for Clemson and Florida State than they need. I don't think they would have nearly the amount of power that they had before all this started in those discussions because they know that they don't really want to be there. So the ACC definitely, I don't think, has much of a reason to bend the knee to these teams and allow them back in, although, you want to keep those two teams intact and would help your conference stay intact, of course. But it seems like it's going to be the Big 12, mostly because these two schools are just trying to find their way out any way they can. But Greg Sankey had plenty to say on that, that's for sure, and he definitely is someone that is going to have a ton to say over the next little bit about the future of college sports overall. So definitely will be really interesting every time we hear from him. The other big thing that I took away from this was Kalen DeBoer has the confidence of pretty much everyone, and really the people that matter the most, which is obviously the players on that team. But it was really, really interesting to hear him speak, to hear others speak about him, to hear especially his players speak about him. And they talked about all of the different changes, all of the different things that have kind of gotten a little bit different this upcoming year. You know, they're playing music at practice, which they used to never do under Nick Saban. It sounds like they're going to do morning practices during spring rather than late practices like Nick Saban did. So there are some ers and ahs that are the same, or that are different, but it feels like the business is the same. It feels like the intensity, the energy around that program hasn't really waned too much. It's obviously different. It's obviously going to be different throughout the season, but as of right now, they look really confident. Tyler Booker said he is definitely the right guy for the job. Malachi Moore and Jalen Milroe spoke really glowingly about him, and those are the guys you need. If you have those three guys in particular, if you have those three guys along with guys like Deontay Lawson, Jahad Carter, if you have those guys bought into what you're doing, you have everyone else on the team, because everyone is watching those guys to see how they should act, how they should go about business, and how they should look at the head coach. If Jalen Milroe is not the biggest fan of Kalen DeBoer and he lets that show to his other teammates, that's going to trickle down, and it's going to cause problems for Kalen DeBoer. But as of right now, it seems like everyone is on the same page, everyone's pulling in the right direction, and everyone's just really, really confident about this guy, including that guy right there. So I think that's going to be a huge thing for him. Will definitely be something that he's going to absolutely love going into the season, that he has these guys, because he really does need them to succeed this upcoming year. But the other thing that happened, obviously, Texas and OU are joining, and that's obviously a huge topic of conversation. Texas really dominated headlines with a number of different comments from Steve Sarkisian about the Arkansas fans hating Texas more than they like themselves, which Sam Pittman agreed with, but Landon Jackson, one of the players for Arkansas, didn't so much agree with. He also got about a million questions about the backup quarterback on this team, Arch Manning, as he probably will for the end of time, if I'm being totally honest with you. But it's very interesting to see these two on that stage, and frankly, if they could change that background to a white next time, I think that would look a lot better, but that's beside the point. I do think that it was really cool seeing all of these, those two brands in particular, along with Texas A&M, along with Arkansas, along with Missouri, some of the teams that they have some of that history with, I think was really awesome. And every single coach that spoke about some of the rivalries that they're getting back, including Steve Sarkisian and Mike Elko and Sam Pittman, all said they just cannot wait. They're so excited to get that underway, and just really love that is back on the schedule. And then Brent Venables is one of those guys that he walks around with his chest out and his head held high at all times. He is the ultimate confidence guy, and one of those guys that I can fully understand why everyone wants to play for him so bad. He is a ultimate I will run through a wall for you type of guy. So very much like him, I think he's someone that is coming into this with some issues. You know, that offensive and defensive line are not where he wants it to be, and I think he would tell you that. But I think at the end of the day, he's very confident in his team's abilities, and at the end of the day, I think he does have a little bit of a season here where, say they go 8-4. I don't think there's Oklahoma fans that are super mad about that. I don't think they necessarily love it. I don't think they're overly over the moon by any means, but I do think they kind of understand what they're up against, and they understand that 8 wins or anything above 8 wins is a win for this season, and kind of take that and move forward. And this guy has such a clear vision for what he wants his program to be, and everything is moving along pretty much exactly as he planned. So it's going really beautifully for him, and I think he's walking into this conference with, at the very least, as much confidence as you could possibly expect from that coach. So very impressed by him. And then the guy that was looming large was Nick Saban. He's obviously passing the torch to that guy right there, Kalen DeBoer, and they exchanged some pleasantries throughout the weekend, but he made his transition to media, made a little bit more money during that process, and he was out in full force. He was all over the place. He started by giving us his SEC title pick. It was UGA versus Texas, so went a little bit chalk for the old coach there, and a lot of people were surprised he didn't pick Bama. I'm telling you confidently, there was no world where he was picking Bama, because there was no world where he was missing a chance to give that team bulletin board material, especially from that guy. So he was absolutely going to pick someone else, and he went with the two teams that are the top teams going into this year. So definitely a very interesting pick there. Tyler Booker took a little bit of shot at him, kind of a fun shot at him, where he always said, don't let anyone who lives in his mom's basement determine how you feel. And he said, I'm not going to let a guy who plays golf all day determine how I feel. So it's kind of that sentiment that Nick Saban left, but the mentality has not changed at all, even when you're talking about Nick Saban. So very much like that. It was, a little bit awkward at points. It was a little bit weird to see him on the SEC network desk and not as a head coach, and some of the other head coaches found that a little bit weird as well. Kirby Smart said before the media meeting with Saban and all of the SEC people, he said it was like giving answers to Darth Vader. It was like giving answers to a guy that has just absolutely dominated you for quite some time and has been the boogeyman for a lot of his career. So obviously that was a very, very interesting thing. He also gave compliments out to just so many people because he finally can. He doesn't have to mince words talking about some of these people. He said Kirby was the best assistant he's ever had. I think everyone can agree on that. And then he said CJ Baxter, the sophomore Texas running back, was the best running back he saw all last year. So that's a very interesting thing. That kid was a freshman last year. So if he takes that another step forward, he could be one of the best in the conference. And then one of the biggest updates from the weekend around Nick Saban was it sounds like a field is being named after him in Tuscaloosa. It sounds like the Bryant-Denny Stadium is going to stay the same, but it is going to be Nick Saban, or probably Saban Field, with the last name thing they got going on over there. There were some fans that wanted to be the Bryant-Saban Stadium, but at the end of the day, I think he's more than happy to have that field, and definitely something that he deserves. So it was very, very cool to see him on the other side of things, but he was just as influential. I can almost promise you that. And then you had some other talking points. Sam Pittman said they were going to embrace the hog this year. Absolutely love that. Makes me want to really buy into the Razorbacks this upcoming year. Randall Cobb is joining the SEC media or network crew, which is really, really cool. A very, very knowledgeable football guy that has been in the sport for just so long. So very much cool energy there. You also had Lane Kiffin, Brian Kelly coming in with a ton of energy. Lane Kiffin took a not so subtle shot at Paul Feinbaum, which was very, very funny. There was a huge debate over Harold Perkins' position going into this year. Billy Napier's had questions about the hot seat. So many things happening out there in Dallas, but it was an awesome week. There's no two ways about that. Every time the SEC Media Days come around, you're in for a week with a ton of headlines, with a ton of talking points, with just a little bit of pettiness in between. So absolutely loved it. It was definitely something that I would absolutely love to be at in 2025, and I have every intention of being at in 2025, covering it and being up close and personal. But at the end of the day, this was a great, great SEC Media Days and just gets us a little bit more excited for the season. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the biggest changes that could be coming to college sports. It sounds like the NCAA is not mad about the idea of the Power Four kind of breaking off and governing itself. So we'll break down what that looks like and how it could totally transform college sports in general right after this. So stick with us.